I'm going to talk to you guys today about improvisation. And when I say improvisation, it's fairly common for people to think, oh yeah, jazz musicians. And these guys are great. You think Miles Davis, Charlie Parker, phenomenal jazz musicians, are awesome improvisers. Or you think Robin Williams or comedians, basically. I think what I want to sort of argue here today is that all of us are phenomenal improvisers. We just haven't noticed it yet. And that improvising is kind of like the earliest and most effective kind of thinking and problem solving. So what I want to show you guys today is how do we improvise? What are the obstacles that get in the way of good improvisation? And basically, how do we become better problem solvers and decision makers sort of on the fly? So courage, creativity, and the self. There's a pretty funny movie, it's fairly poignant as well, called The Three Kings, and some of you have probably seen it. It's David O. Russell. There's a wonderful exchange between two soldiers in that film. It's probably the best example I've seen of sort of characterizing what is courage or bravery. These two guys are about to go into a firefight, and one of them says, "You're scared, right?" And the other soldier says, "Maybe." And the first soldier says, "The way it works is you do the thing you're scared shitless of, and you get the courage after you do it." And the other soldier says, "That's a dumbass way to work. It should be the other way around." And the guy says, "I know, that's the way it works." And I think this is probably true and not well appreciated, I think, by most of us. But one of the things you have to do when you're an improviser is overcome fear. Fear is a tremendous obstacle because it gets you sort of paralyzed, and then you no longer sort of see the immediate situation, and you don't respond well to the actual changes that are going on around you. So I want to show you some great improvisers. This gentleman here on the left, of course, is Bo Diddley. And everybody knows he's one of the great framers of rock and roll, one of the great creators of rock and roll. And this utterly terrified lad behind him is me. So you see on the right-hand side, I got a call. This was many, many years ago when Bo Diddley was still active. "Steve, would you play guitar behind Bo Diddley? He's coming to Chicago." And this was down the street at Buddy Guy's Legends, the original Legends. And I had had a little bit of success at this point as a musician, otherwise they wouldn't have called me, presumably. But nothing on this order of magnitude. This was way over my head and utterly terrifying. And so I did the thing that I think most people would do is I got the entire opus of Bo Diddley on record and listened to everything and figured out every guitar part and got into the deep cuts that nobody's heard in 30 years. And I thought, this is the way to prepare, know everything. And then the day of the performance comes along and we go down to the club, and I'm thinking, well, we're going to at least rehearse with Bo. He's going to tell us what tunes we're doing right. No. Performance time comes. He's nowhere to be seen. And the manager says, "Get up and start playing." And so we're playing on stage, and where's Bo Diddley? And he just comes walking in off the street with his guitar, just storms the stage, plugs in, and starts playing. And we're like, oh my God, what key are we in? What are the chords? What tune is it? No idea. That's a classic improvisation story. And what I found was we were able to find the key, then sort of figure out vaguely what the chord changes were, and then sort of get behind it and lock in. And after the first tune, he turned back to us and said, I'll never forget, it was so bizarre. He said, "This cat is tied, now let's skin it." And we were like, okay, let's skin it, Bo. This was it's a kind of a good example because we did not have any set list or song structure, but all the work that we had done, that I had done figuring out these songs, was somewhere back in my sort of limbic system, in what psychologists call the hot cognition system. I had trained my muscle memory to sort of be able to follow things. There were no actual song parts that I had memorized that sort of inserted into the performance, but in a sense I had the kind of vocabulary that was necessary. And that's a great thing about improvisation is prepare, then forget about it. And try to be more receptive to what's actually happening in the here and now. Now there's other kinds of improvisation too. Cultural improvisation is something we're all doing all the time. If you go to a foreign country and you go down to the market and you don't know the language, or maybe you know a little bit of vocabulary, you are improvising. You're engaging in all kinds of body movement, gestures. You're trying to figure out what they're saying. You're trying to navigate your way through. And so it's very common for us to do cultural improvisation when we're in foreign countries. But this is true also if you just go from urban spaces to rural spaces and back again. So this is China. This is my son in China. We've lived in China on and off for a few years. And it's always an amazing adventure. Even though I learn more every time, it still shocks me and surprises me. Here's a very sort of trivial example of cultural improvisation. We're in China, we're at Tiananmen Square, walking around like other tourists, and it's very common for Chinese people, particularly older Chinese people, to come right up to a kid, especially a foreign kid, and put their hands on his face. This is just very common practice. Like, they're curious, they think he's cute, they want to get into his personal space. But for the kid, it's very surprising and disturbing because we have this notion of personal space, like, don't come up and touch my face. And for the parent, I'm like, oh my God, it's hygienic concerns and all this sort of thing. And we're out on Tiananmen Square, and this guy comes out of nowhere and just like grabs my son's face, and I'm like, whoa, booyah, we don't want this. And I see a cop, and I yell for the cop to come over. I don't even know what I'm thinking, like, well, how's this gonna help? But I don't quite know what else to do, so the cop comes over, and I start to explain to the cop, you know, what's going on, and he's got his hands on my son's face. So I realized, okay, there's some expectations that we have that are cultural, and if you hold to them or cling to them too strong, then you won't be able to adapt to the environment that's happening. And so we learned, you know, how to say, "Genta buyao," I really don't want you to touch my face. But we also learned to roll with it. And sort of good humor and a sense of play is really vital for improvisation. If you're too uptight, then you're going to miss these wonderful opportunities. And that's a fairly trivial example, but it's kind of a fun one. Here's one also fairly trivial, but fun as well. Here's a bit of social improvisation, again in China, but I think you could apply this to all of your travels. I'm doing something very mundane, like buying a watch in a Chinese department store. And when I go through, after I've paid for it, I go through the security detection system, and it starts blaring the alarm. And so I go back, and basically like 4 guys descend on me with walkie-talkies wearing these sort of military outfits. And fine, okay, so we put the bag down and I walk through, and the alarm goes off again. Now managers are coming over, and like a group of people is starting to form around the security device. So I go back, and then I'm standing there, and I'm trying to demonstrate that I don't have anything with me. So I'm like, I have a shirt and pants on, and I've even pulled my pockets out of my pants like a cartoon character who's trying to demonstrate that he doesn't have any money. And I go through, and I keep setting off the alarm. Now a bigger and bigger crowd is forming. And they're not mad about it or angry. They're fairly polite and even apologetic, but nobody seems to be able to let me go through. And here in the States, you just be, well, some kind of magnetic glitch, you know, be on your way. But there we're just standing there and standing there. So finally, I'm like, okay, I just take my shirt off. And now I'm standing there with no shirt on. And there's a big crowd around. I'm like, I go through, the alarm goes off again. So finally, I take my pants off. And I'm standing in a Chinese department store in front of 100 people in my underwear. And but I had to smile and laugh, and then they were smiling and laughing, and in the end, you know, it turned out to be some weird manufacturer's tag that was built into the pants that I'd bought in the States. So I was allowed to go on my way, but this is an example, again, of sort of improvising. They didn't know what to do. There was no protocol for letting me through. I didn't know what to do either. We solved the problem, I think. And I don't know whether I gained face or lost face. I think I probably lost a lot of face, whatever. All right, so then I moved to Cambodia. This is a while ago. And I lived in Cambodia for a while. And one of the things I learned there, I was teaching at the Buddhist Institute in Cambodia. And one of the things you learn about Eastern culture is Buddhism has a notion that says you think you're a self, or you have a soul, or there's some sort of core essential ego within you. But really that doesn't exist. That's a kind of fiction. And one of the goals in Buddhism is to sort of overcome this natural tendency to feel self-important and to sort of have your ego out there in front of everything. And so this idea of selflessness is really important, and I learned it when I was living in Cambodia. It's also really important for improvisation. If your self is in the way, then improvisation usually goes badly. You're too worried about protecting it and making sure it gets status, and usually forms a great obstacle to good improvisation. This is true in music and true in life. And so one of the things that you can see here is a kind of representation. This is obviously sort of a joke version, but many of us think there's this essential self. What I want to suggest is that the Eastern philosophy, like Buddhism, and to some extent Chinese philosophy like Taoism, suggests that we can overcome this notion of self. In Chinese philosophy, particularly Taoism, you'll see the same kind of philosophy. Just like I had studied Bo Diddley's music over and over and the basic sort of maneuvers to make within blues or rock music, then you have to get to this point where you sort of forget about what you learned. And it's basically, you have to let yourself try to just be pure action. There's a wonderful analogy or metaphor within Taoism. They talk about the great butcher, Ding the butcher. This is a Chinese philosopher named Zhuangzi tells this story of a butcher who's so skilled that when he approaches the animal to carve it up, he just sort of, in a few very economic moves, he sort of unravels the animal beautifully, cuts perfectly in the joints and between the sinews, and there's no sort of artificial cutting. Everything is perfectly in keeping with nature, which Taoism is basically calls the Tao, or the way of nature. So your job as an improviser is to sort of be as natural and in the flow of things as possible. And so overcoming the ego is one of the things you have to do in order to achieve this. So what's a recipe then for good improvisation? Here's a very brief sort of 8-step, this is my 8-fold path here. First, study, work, master something. This is something, as a college teacher, I have to sort of encourage students to get past this sense that they can automatically do something well. They watch a lot of sort of reality shows and they think, well, if I just have the right feelings, it'll go well. No, you have to prepare and study and slave and sweat. Then, 2, put yourself under duress. Don't look for the safe space, look for the unsafe space, within reason, of course. Because duress is what draws out of you all this potential. You can't actualize potential unless you're in this kind of demanding context. 3, stop aggrandizing the self or the ego. This is something we automatically do. It's our default position. And instead, serve others or serve music or whatever it is, this higher goal. 4, fail. Fail with grace, but fail. Then 5, fail again. 6, fail again. Finally, 7, succeed and make a difference. And then 8, repeat. And so I want to give you sort of one sort of fun story so that all these points will maybe condense into one image. Buddhism has a set of scriptures called the Jataka tales, and these are oftentimes the way in which young kids in Buddhist countries are taught Buddhism because they can't understand the hardcore philosophy. So they're stories that are a lot like our Aesop's tales, and they have a moral message. And one of them is about the Buddha, a bodhisattva, who's traveling through the jungle on his own, trying to get from one place to another. And this is called the Prince of the 5 Weapons. And he has 5 weapons on him. And he runs across this creature. I did this drawing of it just for fun. This is the furry hug, which, come to think of it, is not a very intimidating name for a monster. But this creature has a thick fur that is incredibly sticky, and everything gets stuck in it. So the Buddha attacks him because he basically says, I'm going to kill you and eat you like I've done everybody else on this pathway. And the Buddha says, no, you're not. So he shoots him with an arrow, and the arrow gets stuck in his fur. And then he throws a dagger at him, and that gets stuck. And it throws another thing, and he basically uses all his weapons. All of the weapons get stuck on this creature. But undaunted and using his fear correctly to improvise, he goes up and he punches the furry hug. And his arm gets stuck in the furry hug. Somebody should really do a graphic novel of this because it's pretty funny. And then he's like, okay, I'll punch again. So he punches with the left arm, and his left arm is stuck in the furry hug. Then you can see where this is going, right? Then the right leg, then the left leg. So finally he's entirely stuck in this monster, and the only thing he's got left is his head, which he then plows into the creature. And now he's stuck entirely at all appendages into the furry hug. But he's undaunted, he doesn't give up, he keeps plowing ahead. The creature is utterly stunned by this and says, who is this lion of a man? Unbelievable, I've never seen anything like it. Why aren't you afraid of me? And the Buddha says, because inside me is the dagger of righteousness. And even if you eat me, the dagger of righteousness will basically cut you up from the inside out, which is sort of a metaphor for saying, the Dharma or the way of Buddhism is that strong. The furry hug basically acquiesces and says, I am converting to Buddhism right now, be on your merry way. And so the Buddha conquers him with this truth rather than just violence. So my point is this, my sort of last moral injunction to you is attack life in the same way that the Buddha attacked the furry hug. Thank you very much.